Good day, Kabibal, and welcome to our Learn at Home series. For the discussion this evening, our topic will be on enhancing student performance through formative assessments. Before we begin, kindly take note of the following reminders. Make sure you're registered to the webinar to have your e-certificate of participation. Visit certificate.bibalgroup.com to generate your proof of attendance. Place your questions in the comment box allotted during the session and they will be addressed by a speaker later on. Share the video using hashtag LearnAs1PH as our official hashtag to our Bibal webinars. Experience learning, Kabibal. And now to proceed with our webinar this evening, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished speaker for today. Mr. Joram Kim Corcuera is a graduate of Bachelor in Secondary Education, major in English at the Philippine Normal University in 2011. He obtained his Master of Arts, major in Communication degree at the Ateneo de Manila University. Currently, he is taking his degree of Doctor of Philosophy, major in English Language Studies at the University of Santo Tomas. He has been a teacher for almost a decade and has already taught English literature, public speaking, and research classes. He also represented the Philippines in various international research and conferences about education and communication. He has been delivering CPD trainings and training sessions and teacher seminars across the country for more than 3 years. He is also into journalism, as he has already experienced handling a number of student publications in various schools and university, including San Beda University and University of Santo Tomas. At present, he is working as a faculty member at the University of Santo Tomas Junior High School, where he teaches communication arts and journalism courses. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Joram Kim Corcuera.
All right. So good evening, everyone. Good evening, of course, to all the viewers that we have today. So magandang gabi po. Sana po maging productive po tayo sa ating webinar today. So of course, in our Learn at Home session today, we're given 30 minutes, of course, to discuss things about, of course, formative assessment. So on that note, let me share po with you the presentation that I actually prepared. All right. So with the many changes in the field of education, many, indeed, of course, have struggled in terms of providing quality education. No wonder a lot of students, a lot of parents already expressed their disappointment in the virtual space. Because maybe some of them think that the education that the kids are receiving nowadays might not be enough to fully prepare them in the future, or maybe to further develop their skills, acquire the knowledge that they need. However, of course, with the emergence of the coronavirus 2019 pandemic, we do not have a choice. We cannot conduct face-to-face classes. Therefore, of course, we should be able to find the right combination, and of course, to make kumbaga, the virtual space work for us, and eventually, of course, to maximize the many promises that online education can do for us. But specifically, okay, what can we do virtually to enhance student performance? Okay, so in our webinar today, of course, we're going to explore how formative assessments, okay, can help us, of course, improve the way we teach online. Of course, develop, may help us in terms of helping our students acquire the knowledge and develop the skills that they actually need. All right. So again, welcome to our webinar today entitled Enhancing Student Performance Through Formative Assessment. All right. So allow me to start my presentation with a quote. Diba? If you were able to watch my previous webinars, of course, under Vival, I always start with what I call dati tawag ko dito quote of the day. But right now, of course, since we're only given 30 minutes, in-adjust ko na konti. Ang tawag ko na ngayon ay quote of the session. Right? Today's quote of the session, of course, comes from Grant Wiggins. Sabi niya, learners need endless feedback more than they need endless teaching. Okay? Unfortunately, we have to accept the fact, the brutal reality, that more of us focus into teaching our students. But sometimes, because lalo na sa online, di ba? Because we have limited time, of course, to teach our students, ang tendency ay na medyo napapabayaan natin yung, of course, assessment. Okay? And without assessment, of course, we wouldn't be able to give feedback. But we have to understand, okay, just like what Grant Wiggins said, we have to understand that our students need not only kumbaga, the teaching from the teacher, but they also need, of course, our guidance, and of course, kumbaga, yung pagbibigay natin sa kanila ng continuous feedback. Because this is the only way for them to be able to know the Achilles heel, kung ano yung kailangan nila i-develop, their weaknesses, their strengths as well. All right? So, and of course, we would be able to know these things through assessment. That's why today, okay, we're going to define and identify assessment in the 21st century. So before I discuss about formative assessment, let us try to discuss first. When we talk about assessment in the 21st century, ano nga ba ito? Diba? I can still remember a few years ago, talagang few, diba? When I was still a high school student, okay, of course, my teachers would always, kumbaga, talagang give me a pen and paper exam. But in the 21st century, okay, ito pa rin ba yung klase na exam na dapat tinitake ng mga kabataan? Alright? So allow me, of course, to answer this question, okay, after I emphasize to you kung gaano kahalaga ang salitang assessment. Okay? I do not know if you will agree with me, but I think you will, okay, that students can escape bad teaching, but they can never escape bad assessment. When they say bad teaching, maraming batang pwedeng, lalo sa online, di ba, they can skip classes. Or pwede silang umattend ng klase, pero ang totoo, they are not in front of the screens. Because, let's say, for example, they find the strategy of the teacher boring. They don't find it enjoyable. They don't find it entertaining. It's not it's not an attention getter, for example. Then they can escape those things if they want to. Kahit sa physical classes, sa face-to-face classes, if they don't want to listen to the teacher, they can just simply pretend as if they're listening, but they're not. But all of the students, they can never escape bad assessment. Why? Because it is through assessment, of course, that we're able to determine if they're ready for the next level or not. Okay? So kahit makinig sila or hindi, kailangan nila magkaroon ng isang assessment. So kahit gaano kaganda ang assessment, ita-take nila yon. Ganun din kahit pasabihin natin medyo hindi tama yung assessment, ita-take din nila yon. Okay? That is why, gaya nung sinabi ko kanina, di ba, if we are not able to provide good assessment, then anong mangyayari sa mga bata? Siguro, kagaya ng iba, maniniwala sila dun sa salitang, oh, well, I'll just answer them all C. Di ba? Natatandaan ko when I was about to take the licensure examination for teachers, sabi nila, pag di mo alam yung sagot, letter C lang. Although I'm not sure, of course, if that is true, but I think most of the, I heard that often. Madalas ko talaga naririnig po yun. We also don't want our students to have the answer na, I have no idea what our teachers are asking us to do. Okay? What they're even asking me to do. Okay? Ayaw natin ganun ang reaction nila. Right? So this is, for us to be able to avoid this kind of reaction, then we should be able, of course, to assess them the right way in the 21st century. Gaya ng sinabi ko kanina, the question is, the way we were assessed before by our teachers, ito pa rin po ba yung way na ina-assess natin dapat ang mga kabataan ngayon? Okay? So let's try to see. Okay? So in your screen right now, of course, meron ditong apat na sagot, okay, with regards to how we design a 21st century assessment. So let us start with the first one. Sabi, students must demonstrate what they have learned. Okay? So in the assessment tool, mahalagang mahalaga that the student will be able, of course, to apply what they have learned. Hindi lang yung tipong memorization. Right? So whatever they create with digital tools should still represent what students were able to learn. The assessment should not tell you more about how they use the tool than it does about the students' work using the tool. Okay? So mahalagang mahalaga lang po, of course, hindi lang kung paano natin sila in-assess, pero mahalaga din, of course, kung paano natin bibigyan ng opportunity yung mga bata i-apply yung kanilang natutunan. Okay? So that's one. Second, students should demonstrate content proficiency and sophistication. Of course, their new product, di ba kapag we ask them to come up with a performance task, dalawa lang naman ang dulo na. It's either a product or of course a performance. Okay? So this specific product, okay, should be able to reflect the content knowledge that they have learned and the multiple cognitive zones they participated during the learning process. So ito parang kagaya lang din to dati. Although I think in the olden times, kung ba sa traditional setup, kadalasan we talk about demonstration of content, talagang pen and paper, talagang nakafocus tayo sa memorization, bihila yung projects, di ba? Right now, it would be more focused into application. No wonder, of course, DepEd puts, kumbaga, premium sa skills, di ba, more than knowledge, right? Kaya ang performance kasi ng pinakamataas talaga na component na bumubuo, of course, sa ating grading system. Third, of course, students should be frequently reflecting on their choices. Students, of course, should be able to articulate and defend their tool choices, content inclusion, and degrees of audience interaction, and how those choices affected the resulting product. Okay? So in other words, we have to leave room for creativity. Okay? Hindi na to kagaya nung dati na pag humingi tayo ng task, talagang isang itsura lang talaga ng product. Talagang we expect one product. Iba-iba lang yung gagawa. But right now, of course, kumbaga, if let's say for example, our goal is to be able to disseminate information. It could, of course, our students can produce different types of product, okay? Allowing them, of course, to make various decisions. Okay, that would affect, of course, their product and, of course, their performance. And lastly, napakalaga, lalong-lalo na po sa online, students must know how to give credit, okay, to where credit is actually due. Okay? So they should be familiar with the issues about plagiarism, about copyright, and how to search for, and of course, use appropriate content, give attribution for the media resources that they use. Teachers, sanayin natin ang mga bata to give credit. Sabi ko nga sa mga estudyante ko, kung kayo yung, for example, mananakawan ng ideas na pinaghirapan niyo, okay, what would you feel? Sabi nila, they would feel bad. Okay? And ganun po yung nangyayari, di ba? Magagano yung nangyayari because the students are thinking, okay, hindi naman malalaman. But then again, we have to tell them, we have to teach them that plagiarism, of course, is a crime. So therefore, they must learn how to, of course, give credit to where credit is due. Lalo-lalo na po sa online na talagang everything that they need, of course, would always be available online. So talagang dapat matuto yung mga bata, of course, ng proper attribution. All right? So those are the things that you have to remember, of course, in making a 21st century assessment. Yeah, and when we talk about assessment, dalawa lang naman po yan, di ba? We always have, of course, what we call formative and summative assessment. Sabi nila, formative assessment happens when the chef, of course, tastes the soup. And summative assessment happens when the guest tastes the soup. In simpler terms, okay, pag ang chef ang tumikim ng soup mo, what would happen? Sasabihin lang sa'yo, ay, parang kulang sa tamis. So what would you do? Okay? Lalagyan mo ng sugar. The next time that you're going to prepare it, you know na dapat mas maraming sugar. So you would be able to learn how to do it. Right? And how to do it better specifically. However, in the summative test, kapag guest ang tumikim ng soup at hindi masarap ang soup, what would happen? You would be losing customers. Okay? So in other words, ganun din po sa bata. They would be losing grade. Kumbaga, bababa ang kanilang performance, bababa ang kanilang grade because it's already a summative assessment. That is why, as teachers and as parents, it is a must for us to understand the differences, of course, between a formative assessment and a summative assessment. When I talk about the formative assessment, of course, the goal of a formative assessment is really to monitor student learning and providing ongoing feedback. Okay? So, in other words, ang goal lang nito, one, to check nasan na ba mga estudyante, naintindihan na ba nila, hindi pa naintindihan. Kung hindi pa, ano ang dapat idipin para mas maintindihan nila. And on the other hand, when we talk about summative assessment, it's to evaluate student learning. So meaning to say, kapag baksak sila sa formative assessment, that's okay. Although hindi naman talaga okay na okay, pero technically, mas acceptable yun because they would still be given a chance to work on it. Diba? To know how to understand things better and eventually be able to apply it. Kung ano yung skill, ano yung knowledge na kailangan nilang matutunan. Okay? Before taking a summative test. But pag summative test, kapag lumabas na mababa sila, then it means that they were not able to learn, okay? Of course, the lesson, or they were not able to develop the skill that kumbaga their teachers tried to help them na i-develop sa klase. Okay? So more specifically, when I talk about formative assessment, again, it helps students identify the strengths and their weaknesses. And summative assessments, of course, ito naman yung kadalasan high stakes, diba? Which means, of course, high point value. Okay? So, but today, of course, our focus would not be on summative assessment. Okay? Our focus would be mainly about formative assessment. Okay? So, what is formative assessment? Okay? Ano nga ba po ba, bakit nga ba mahalaga ang formative assessment? Okay? Let me answer this one by sharing to you a quotation, okay, from Carol Ann Tomlinson. Of course, isa rin siya sa mga dahilan kung bakit sumikat ang differentiated instruction. Sabi ni Carol Ann Tomlinson, informative assessment is not an end itself, but the beginning of better instruction. Okay? So in other words, assessment, okay, dito pa lang po pinapakita, assessment plays an important role, of course, for our students to be able to gain academic success. And specifically, today, ang focus po natin, of course, would be how we will be able to utilize formative assessment to help our students, of course, gain academic success. So on that note, allow me to define to you, although define ko na kanina, but at least right now, let's try to dig deeper. What is formative assessment? Okay, so formative assessment, of course, you can see it from here. One, evaluation of student comprehension, learning needs, and academic progress. So the word itself, evaluation. Dito natin malalaman, naintindihan ba ng bata, okay, yung lesson? Nakuha ba, na-develop ba nila yung kailangan nilang ma-develop, na kailangan nilang ma-develop, of course, in line with the curriculum, of course, following the curriculum given by the Department of Education. Is there an academic progress o baka naman walang usad yung bata? Umaattend ng isang buong quarter ng online class pero napansin mo wala palang usad, right? Another one, of course, collect detailed information. Why is it important for us to collect detailed information? Because it is through this information that we are able to know ano ang kailangan natin idipin sa mga bata. Ano ang kailangan nating ipaintindi sa mga bata. Okay? So, next, of course, identify concepts that students are struggling to understand, skills that they are having difficulty acquiring. Because imagine, right now, online learning, napakahirap makita ng bata, napakahirap kilalanin ng bata, and the question is, how are you going to address their diverse needs? How are you going to address the interests, the preferences of these discrete individuals? Napakahirap. But of course, through assessments, we would be able to know, lalo na pa nag-item analysis pa tayo, di ba? We would be able to know alin bang area ang kailangan na tulungan ng bata. O sinong mga bata ang nahihirapan sa ganitong konsepto, ang nahihirapan sa mag-develop ng ganitong skill. And then of course, all those things, lahat po yan, mabibigay po yan ng formative assessments. Alright? And lastly, of course, again, ito po tatandaan natin, formative assessment refers to the tasks that are checked and recorded but are not graded. Meaning to say, we check them and we record it. Bakit po kailangan natin siya i-record kahit hindi naman siya graded? So that we would know, baka mamaya, for example, makita natin yung bata. Limang formative test, ang score, 2 out of 10, 2 out of 10, 2 out of 10, 2 out of 10, 2 out of 10. That means something. It's either the problem is with the student or the problem is with the teacher. Di ba? Baka mamaya hindi nakiklik yung style ni teacher sa student. So the teacher, of course, must be able to address that one. Di ba? Pero kung for example, ang score 2 out of 10, 4 out of 10, 5 out of 10, tas 8 out of 10, 10 over 10. It means that the student, kahit slowly, nade-develop na yung skill na dapat i-develop. Of course, that is the beauty of what we call formative assessment. Alright? So, when we talk about formative assessment, Okay? We have to understand the concept of quality over quantity. Okay? Bakit po quality over quantity? Ako po, to be honest, madami ako magbigay ng formative assessment. I give a lot of formative assessments to my students. Lalo na ngayong online kasi technically, di ba, parang lagi nilang sasabihin, ay parang ang hirap intindihin kapag synchronous class. Minsan manonood na lang sila ng recording. Pero technically, how would they know na naintindihan talaga nila yung lesson? Di ba? And yung mga batang yan, kahit naman digital natives, nahiyain pa din sila magtanong sa mga teachers nila. So, ako, I give a lot of formative assessment. But still, it would not really, kumbaga, depend dun sa number na binibigay mo. It would help. But then again, kahit pagano kadami ang formative assessment mo, kung yung formative assessment mo naman, let's say, for example, would not be able to address the competency that we're trying to assess, walang mangyayari. Okay? So it's always quality over quantity. Hindi po tayo pwede, for example, ang topic natin, kunyari, nouns and pronouns, ang gagawin na lang natin, okay, worksheet nouns and pronouns, Google, okay, download, formative 1, formative 2, formative 3. Ang dami mo nga pong formative, but the question is, are these formative assessments able to assess what you should be able to assess? Yung tinuro mo po ba, yung ba yung na-assess? Because if not, it might even, kumbaga, lead to frustration sa part ng mga estudyante. Alright? So put in mind, my dear teachers, that research on the use of formative assessment has shown that when teachers practice good formative assessment and students participate in it, both achievement and motivation increase. So in other words, kasi nawawala yung position ng bata. Kumbaga talaga namang, uy, naiintindihan ko na. What would happen to the kids? What would happen to the children? They would become more engaged. They would become more participative, more active, of course, para mas kasi nakikita nilang nakakasabay na sila. Okay, so pag tumaas ang motivation, most likely tataas din ang achievement. Alright? So now, let me proceed to the different examples or different types of assessment strategies that we can have, of course, for formative assessment. Of course, number one, we have summary and reflection. So students, of course, here stop and reflect, make sense of what they have heard, what they have read, and then the like. Ngayon, kanilang learning experiences, mahalaga po yan. Although, for some cases, pwede naman po natin gawing summative assessment, of course, ang reflection. Okay? Second, of course, we have the list, the charts, the graphic organizers. Okay, so here, of course, the students make connections and note relationships between and among the different concepts that they have learned. So again, pwede rin itong formative or pwede rin itong summative. Of course, depende kay teacher. But we have to understand, my dear po, teachers, my dear parents, as much as possible po, actually, this is a golden rule. No summative assessment hanggat walang formative assessments. It's always formatives before the summatives. Next, of course, visual representations of information. Okay, students will use both words and pictures to make connections and increase memory, facilitating retrieval of information later on. So this is another way, of course, of assessment. And lastly, of course, the collaborative activities, yung kanilang mga group activities, na pwede rin naman natin gradean as summative or pwede rin naman, of course, as formative. All right? So another set of examples would be oral and written recitation through discussion board. Okay, 'di ba parang minsan ang hirap talaga ng oral recitation ngayon, 'di ba? So kadalasan talaga ang teachers nag-rely sa written recitation or recitation, of course, sa mga discussion boards. You can also have formatives, yung mga drafts ng essays, drafts ng other written outputs, even pen and paper exams, okay? Exit sleeves, exit tickets, individual and group performances, and then the like. So napakarami pong halimbawa ng formative assessments. Okay? But right now, allow me to share with you other formative assessments or other sources of formative assessments, of course, na pinoprovide ng BIBAL. Of course, we have here yung ating, kung napanood niyo yung video kanina, yung learning kit. Okay? This learning kit contains a lot of lessons and it contains as well a lot of assessments that teachers and parents can use para talagang mas maintindihan ng bata. Kasi let's say, for example, kunwari, tinuro ng teacher, hindi pa rin naiintindihan. If ikaw as parent, okay, you have these books with you, you can also use these books, of course, to help the student. O, tingnan mo, ito, sagutan mo to. Pag di nasagutan ng bata, ituro. Hanggang sa magsagot, at least you would not be making, of course, additional exercises anymore. Anyway, this specific kit, kompleto po yan, AP, Filipino, Science, English, math, kumbaga yung major subjects natin, of course, meron yan lahat. Okay? Ang makaganda po dyan, of course, naka-fit in yan, kumbaga tailor fit yan sa competencies, of course, provided by the Department of Education. Alright? So, ayan naman yung pang science, di ba? Ayan, ito yung pang math, science, and many more. Again, may mga lectures, and then of course, meron ding mga tinatawag natin na of course assessments, okay, which of course the teachers can use para maging formative assessment, or even the parents of course can use para talagang to further help, kumbaga talaga maintindihan talaga ng bata yung lesson, right? Another thing of course that formative assessment, kumbaga isa sa mga promise ng formative assessment is that formative assessment, okay, is believed to be the cornerstone of differentiated instruction. Okay? So kung napanood nyo ko last week, ang tinong ko last week is about differentiated instruction. Of course, right now that we're using online, kumbaga mas mataas yung chances that we actually implement differentiated instruction. Okay? Pero anong connection ng differentiated instruction sa formative assessment? Okay? So teachers often want to know where to start with differentiated instruction, as it can seem overwhelming and daunting. Assessment, as it turns out, is really the cornerstone of differentiated instruction. Why? Look at this one. What's the first step to differentiated instruction? It is conducting pre-assessment. Because through this, we would be able to know anong level ng bata. Sino ang, let's say, for example, medyo struggling, sino ang average, o sino naman ang talagang advanced learner. And at the end of the day, how would you measure if the differentiated instruction strategy that you have implemented is effective? Of course, it would refer to the last step. And the last step is also an assessment. Of course, that would check whether or not the students are able to acquire the knowledge and develop the skills that they actually need. Kaya napakahalaga po talaga, of course, ng tinatawag natin na of course, formative test or assessments. Okay? So doon natin malalaman yun. Diba? So bago, diba pa nag-differentiated pre-assessment, differentiated, then post-assessment, formative ulit. Tapos pag nakita okay na, then that's the time, of course, that you will be having summative tests. Alright? So now allow me to share with you some recommendations and tips that we can actually use when it comes to formative assessment. Number one, if we're having, of course, performance, like performances or products, okay, always remember that we have to keep clear criteria for what defines good performance. Okay? Hindi ito yung kagaya ng mga contest na okay, creativity 20%, for example, clarity 30%. Hindi pwedeng ganun. Kailangan may rubric para at least talaga naiintindihan talaga ng bata what they are being asked to do. Of course, use this formative assessment, of course, as a way also for you to encourage student self-reflection. Lalo na po ngayon, talagang there are a lot of mental health issues, and allowing them, of course, to write, kumbaga share what they feel through this specific kumbaga reflection papers would also help them, of course, release their inner thoughts, di ba? Saka at the same time, of course, it's also a way for you to understand where the students are coming from. Next, of course, these formative assessments. When giving this, always remember that you have to give them an actionable feedback. Pag nagbigay tayo ng assessment, make sure na kaya nating ibalik. Hindi yung magbibigay tayo sa dabakbak na assessment, tapos ibabalik natin at the end of the quarter. Why? Kailangan mabigay natin agad yung feedback because through this feedback, the students are able to know how would they able to improve their performance. Ano yung kailangan nilang baguhin, ano yung kailangan nilang mas matutunan. Of course, encourage teacher and peer dialogue through learning. Okay? So, kausapin natin palagi yung mga bata. Open communication po talaga tayo sa mga bata. Mahirap man, lalo sa online, but of course, this is something that is part of our profession. So, I'm pretty sure kayang-kaya naman natin itong gawin. Next, of course, collect information which can be used to help shape teaching. Again, my dear teachers, the data that you would be getting from the result of the formative assessments would be vital for you to be able to know what you should be doing on the next lesson, what approach should you be actually having, what is specific strategy ang i-implement mo, and then the like. And lastly, of course, it must provide opportunities to close the gap between the current and the side performance. Siyempre, meron tayong tinatawag na competencies. May tinatawag tayo na teaching objectives. Pag hindi na-meet ng bata yun, of course, ibig sabihin, meron tayong kailangan pang gawin, kailangan natin silang tulungan para ma-meet yun. And of course, the result of the formative assessment, and the formative assessment themselves, okay, would be a big help for us, of course, to close the gap between these two. Okay? Always remember, my dear parents, my dear teachers, or my dear students who are watching right now, okay? You cannot control what you cannot measure. In assessment, of course, for us to be able to come up with a good formative assessment, we should be able to assess what we are actually teaching. Okay? Hindi yung tipong, for example, i-assess natin isang bagay na hindi naman natin tinuro. Also, of course, dun sa quotation naman, sabi, you cannot control what you cannot measure. So in other words, okay, a good assessment, okay, of course, targets measurable objectives. At doon po tayo magsisimula. Okay? In order for us to be able, of course, to create a good assessment, di ba may mga TOS pang tinatawag, okay? Of course, the learning competencies, okay, should always be put into consideration when it comes to creating a good assessment, because it is through these assessments that we are able to know and determine if the students are successful, of course, in acquiring the specific knowledge, developing the specific skills, okay, and eventually reaching academic success. All right? So it's 7:30. Ayan, sakto-sakto 7:30. So on that note, I end my presentation. Thank you so much. If you have questions, you can email me at jcorcuera@vivalgroup.com. All right? Sana po may naintindihan tayo today. Again, we'll talk about assessments. Mahalagang-mahalaga po yan. Right? Lalong-lalo na po sa online. Hindi pwedeng makikinig lang tayo sa turo ng teacher. Kailangan po talaga there would always be assessment. And the students themselves can also do a self-assessment, of course, para talagang ma-check din nila kung talaga nakakasunod sila or hindi. Alright? That's all po, Ms. Michelle.
Thank you po, Sir Joram. We have one question here po
Sige po.
from Miss Samantha Aguilar po. Hi, sir. How can we assess our students po in terms of development and performance who are in modular learning?
Yun, modular learning. Alam niyo po, 'di ba, when it comes to modular learning, syempre kulang kasi talaga yung, hindi naman kulang, kumbaga, medyo nawawala talaga yung student-teacher interaction. Pero of course, the scores themselves, mahalaga po yun na makikita po nila doon kapag, for example, in the module, kunyari module 1, for example, ang score ng bata, sabihin natin medyo hindi satisfactory. Okay, pag patuloy pong ganun, obviously, the student is not being able, of course, to develop the skill. Okay, so yung result po ng module, ito po yung data na pwedeng gamitin ni teacher to know alin ang dapat madipin. So for example po, kunwari, sabi natin module 1, okay, kunwari science, tapos sabi natin parts of the body, maraming batang mababa, for example, kunwari sa parts of the body na lesson. Okay? So ano pong pwedeng gawin ni teacher? The teacher could give additional activities. Of course, kumbaga that would help the student understand further yung tinatawag natin na parts of the body. Okay? So kung ano yung struggling sila, bago tayo mabove sa next lesson, mahalaga, of course, na we would be considering those things. Lalo na, di ba, spiral curriculum tayo. So, minsan, pahirap ng lesson, parang prerequisite ng one lesson to the other. So, the students would be having a hard time trying to understand a more complicated concepts kung yung basic skills, basic things na dapat na maintindihan, hindi pa niya na ma-master. Okay, so, the data that we receive, of course, of the results of the module, yung exams, of course, mahalaga to na magamit natin for us to be able to, kumbaga, provide the necessary intervention for the kids, for the students specifically. Ayun po.
Thank you, Sir Joram, for answering that question. So there we have it. In behalf of Ibal Group Incorporated, I would like to thank you, Sir Joram, for being our speaker for this evening, for this insightful learning session. It is an honor to have you with us today, sir. And to all our Kabibal viewers, all thanks to you for your continuous patronage to our daily learning session. We encourage you to subscribe and watch on our official Vibal Facebook page and YouTube channel. Muli maraming salamat and have a nice weekend, everyone. Goodbye and stay safe.
Stay safe, everyone. God bless.